Thank you. Thank you, Laura. And again, we want to thank you for joining today's session, Creating Safe Spaces for Youth and Caregivers in the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court. Next slide. The host of today's virtual conference is the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. TLPI is dedicated to providing free publication resources, comprehensive training, and technical assistance for Native nations and tribal justice systems in pursuit of our vision to empower Native communities to create and control their own institutions for the benefit of all community members now and for future generations. And as part of TLPI, I'm joining you as a member of the Tribal Youth Resource Center team. I serve as a co-director, and it's my honor to be here today. I'm grateful to be spending time with you. Welcome all of you to this space. The Tribal Youth Resource Center is a cooperative partner of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and is currently housed at TLPI. As part of this cooperative agreement, we serve tribal grantees in CTAS Purpose Areas 8, which is Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts, and CTAS Purpose Area 9, which are tribal youth programs. We are also able to provide free training and technical assistance to all federally recognized tribes and to communities who wish to initiate prevention initiatives for tribal youth. And so we're very grateful to be here with you. We are also here joined by our partner, the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And we can go to the next slide. I want to welcome Veronica and Kimmy here today. They're going to introduce themselves and share a little bit more about the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And I'll pass that over to you.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Veronica Willetto DeCrane. I am a training and technical assistance manager with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. It's been my pleasure to be with the Trauma Center, and as Anna explained, we have a partnership with the Tribal Youth Resource Center to provide trauma-informed care training and technical assistance to CTAS Purpose Area 8 and 9 grantees, as well as any tribes across the United States. So a little bit about me. I am Dene Navajo. I grew up in Ojo Encino, New Mexico, on the eastern side of the Navajo Reservation, and I live in Billings, Montana with my family. And my background is primarily in education, and I have the privilege of managing this partnership with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute that we have to provide TTA services through the Tribal Youth Resource Center. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague and let her introduce herself as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Kimmy Wind Hummingbird. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Nation. And to give you some quick background information on me, my career prior to joining NNCTC was spent working at the Cherokee and Muskogee Nations. All of that time was in children and family programs, and more specifically within Indian child welfare. I began as a boots on the ground worker, and providing direct services to the families of my communities is the part of my career that I look back on the fondest. I have, since that time, I've managed, directed departments and grown existing systems and implemented new ones. I've written policy and procedure for programs with a child and family focus, child and family and tribal community focus. And I'm joining you today from my home on the Muskogee Reservation in Oklahoma, where we're receiving some much needed rain. It's really hot here in Oklahoma, so we appreciate getting a break from the Oklahoma heat. Thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. Anna.
Thank you, Kimmy and Veronica. We can go to the next slide.
Well, just to give you a little bit of a background on the National Native Children's Trauma Center, in case we are new to you, we are a Category 2 trauma treatment center. We are part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and funded by SAMHSA. And so as a Category 2 trauma treatment center, we provide training and technical assistance. Others in the network provide direct service. And do research around trauma. So our role is to provide training and technical assistance. Next slide.
So as part of the partnership that we have with the National Native Children's Trauma Center, NNCTC has been able to offer a number of communities that are currently funded under OGJDP with individualized training for their communities specific to trauma-informed care. And we felt it was very important to continue building from last year's enhancement training. And so we wanted to continue the discussion into more specifically the topic of grief and loss. And so if you were able to join us last year, you heard from another colleague at NNCTC talk about some of the foundational elements of trauma-informed care and the importance of considering it as part of juvenile healing to wellness court development. And so we hope today's conversation continues to build off of those concepts and reiterate the importance of addressing the individualized needs of those who are entering into a juvenile healing to wellness court. And I know Kimmy and Veronica have a lot of information to convey today, so I'm going to hand it off to them, but we look forward to today's conversation, the dialogue, and the questions that come out of these conversations. So with that, I will hand it back off to Veronica and Kimmy. And thank you again for your contributions to the virtual conference and to today's session.
Next slide, please. Before we get started, let me highlight what you can expect to hear from us today. Impacts, short-term and long-term, of childhood exposure to trauma and traumatic stress. Discussion on traumatic experiences that can impact tribal youth, including the pandemic. Certain details to consider when creating a safe place for the trauma-impacted youth with whom you work, and strategies to best serve the Native youth involved in the tribal juvenile healing to wellness courts. Throughout our training, we will be referencing multiple sources to provide you with the most current information and data. There's a list available in our handouts that you can review and access for further reference. Why is it important to learn about trauma exposure? Research shows that 75 to 93% of justice-involved youth have been exposed to multiple types of violence and traumatic events before contact with the juvenile justice system. Trauma-informed care provides an environment created on a foundation of safety, empowerment, collaboration, trust, and respect. Many youth who have been abused turn to alcohol and drugs to self-medicate and avoid dealing with the trauma they've experienced. Most substance abuse clients have histories of traumatic events, such as molestation, attachment disorder, abuse, and a lack of stable environment that occurred before adulthood. You, the wellness court teams, have a unique opportunity to provide highly individualized case management, support, and referral to treatment. Again, laying that foundation for them to grow as you surround them with the supports to assist the young person. Your teams can develop protocols or policies to identify unique youth strengths and needs through early screening and ongoing support. You can recognize their strengths, address the needs of the youth, meet them where they are, and develop a plan to assist them moving forward. Everything that we expect and believe about ourselves, other people, and the world we live in is learned through experience. Trauma is an experience that profoundly shapes how we see the world. Let's clarify the definition of trauma we will be using in our training today. The definition you see on this slide is a simplified version of the one mental health professionals use to diagnose trauma. Trauma is the experience of a real or perceived threat to your life or safety, or to the life or safety of a loved one. The experience causes an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, and fear. Some people call what we are defining here psychological trauma, in order to distinguish it from the term trauma as used in medical settings. Medical doctors use trauma to refer to a major physical injury to the body, such as the blunt force trauma one might experience in a car accident, or a penetrating trauma that might result from a bullet or knife wound. Sometimes this is called physical trauma. Physical trauma can also result in psychological trauma. I want to draw your attention to the first part of our definition. the experience of a real or perceived threat. Notice that we don't say that trauma is an event that is life-threatening from some kind of objective scientific point of view. What the definition focuses on is the person's experience of the threat. You and I may live through the same event, a car wreck, for example, but experience it very differently. If I experience the car wreck as a threat to my life or safety and am overwhelmed by terror and fear, then I have experienced trauma. It doesn't matter if you, in the passenger seat, believe that we were never in danger. This is a key concept that we will come back to. While we focus on a person's subjective perceptions when determining whether or not an experience is traumatic, research and clinical experience also show that the nature of the underlying event can have a powerful influence on a person's responses. There are lots of different ways of classifying trauma based on the nature of the underlying events. Some of the different types of trauma you will hear talked about today in this way are acute trauma, which has trauma responses based on exposure to a single event. Examples include violent incidents, accidents, or the sudden loss of a loved one. Chronic trauma may have trauma responses based on exposure to multiple different events. For example, one person experiences a car wreck and the loss of a loved one and community violence. Or someone may have repeated exposure to the same type of event, like ongoing physical or sexual abuse. Complex trauma may have trauma responses to multiple repeated events, like chronic trauma, but also include the wide-ranging developmental effects that combine trauma responses, making them more complicated to treat. Complex trauma often arises in situations of neglect or abuse at the hands of a caregiver. The fact that the person who is meant to protect the child is the one creating the situations of overwhelming harm intensifies the mental health issues. Historical trauma has trauma responses to mass historical events of genocide when the intent is to destroy a whole people, such as a tribe or race. Historical trauma is experienced by all or most members of a group. Remember that members of the same group may experience and be impacted by historical trauma differently. Intergenerational trauma is when the trauma is transferred or passed on from one generation to the next. One of the critical tasks for a developing child's brain and body is learning to deal with stress. Stress is not always negative, nor are its effects always harmful. We experience stress in response to threats. Imagine that you are a small child in a loving home playing in your front yard. The neighbor's dog approaches and you perceive the dog as a threat. Your heart rate increases, adrenaline is released to your bloodstream, and stress hormones flood your body. This is your brain and body's way of preparing you to act on the threat in one of three ways: fight, flight, or freeze. Maybe you will hit the dog and drive it away. Maybe you will run away from it. Or maybe you will freeze in place, hoping that the dog will lose interest in you. Let's say that this particular dog is not aggressive. Within a few seconds of appearing in your yard, the dog sniffs you, licks your face, and walks back to its own yard. You feel the threat recede and your stress responses recede also. Or if, on the other hand, the dog continues to show interest in a way that you perceive to be threatening, but your mother sees what's happening and comes to comfort you. In that case, you feel protected, buffered from the threat, and your stress responses likely fade. When children routinely experience stress in one of these two ways, the threat recedes quickly, or a caregiver provides support and comfort in a response to the threat, they develop healthy stress responses. The other side of that is unhealthy stress. Stress can become a very negative influence in a child's life. When a child's stress responses are regularly activated and stay activated instead of fading, the child fails to develop healthy stress responses. Their brain and body remain on red alert most of the time. The two main reasons stress responses might not fade are the opposite of the two conditions that make for healthy stress responses. The stressful event keeps happening over and over, and no caring adult protects the child from the stressful event when it happens. So a child who is routinely subjected to abuse, experiences one sudden loss after another, or is neglected and left to cope with their own threatening situations is in these cases when their stress responses stay activated. The child system triggers fight, flight, or freeze responses, not only in situations of danger, but also in situations where there is no danger. It is an unhealthy stress. It changes the way the brain develops. It takes a physical toll on our bodies, and it leads to attempts to cope that are maladaptive or harmful. Even though our initial responses to threat may be an unconscious reaction, our brain is the first to process the information and initiates our automatic stress response, along with the actions we use to protect ourselves or others we care about. To understand this process, let's quickly discuss a couple of key parts of the brain and why it's important to use this information to understand a youth's behavior. First, the information that a person receives about what is threatening comes from our senses, also known as sensory information. Without conscious awareness, many sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and physical sensations are being encoded by our brain. Second, this information is processed by our brain, but it's very important to understand which part of the brain is processing the information at different points during the experience. For a simple explanation, let's think of dividing the brain into two main areas, survival brain and learning brain. The survival brain consists of the limbic system and is responsible for many of our initial emotional responses that are linked to spotting danger or threats and holding on to those memories about danger from the past. It also screens what information goes to the learning brain. The learning brain consists of the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex and is responsible for executive functioning skills that make sophisticated behaviors like controlling impulses and making sound decisions possible. Fortunately, these executive functioning skills can be learned even if their skills appear undeveloped for a youth or underdeveloped for the youth. Our response to threat is natural and protects us from danger, but it can become unhealthy if we are constantly on high alert for danger because danger is constantly present. When this happens, it can condition the youth to look for danger or interpret a situation as dangerous, even if it's not. How youth respond to this can change based on their developmental level. Our response to protect ourselves is ingrained and can be set off when youth are reminded about times they were unsafe. The fight, flight, or freeze response refers to an activation of part of the nervous system that prepares us to deal with the threat, the sympathetic nervous system. When activated, it initiates a stress response. It's responsible for an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. It also sends blood rushing to the muscles. It is also linked to the endocrine system, which is responsible for secretion of stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. This further fuels our fight, flight, or freeze stress response. It's important to note that this response is normal and is an automatic biological response each of us have when we believe we're being threatened or feeling stress. Next slide. Some examples of what fight, flight, or freeze may look like are listed here. In flight mode, one might be withdrawn, a daydreamer, avoid others, or become disengaged. In fight mode, they may act out, behave aggressively, be the class clown always getting the laughs, or scream and yell. Freeze mode can look like a refusal to respond or answer a direct question, to stare blankly at you or away from any person, or even feel unable to move or act. Their body literally freezes. Some traumatic stress reactions may have been useful when the traumatic event occurred, but now the individual continues to use them and they get in the way of their ability to function at school, work, and in relationships. We know that when we see these traumatic stress reactions, it often means that the youth survival brain is activated. Hyperarousal and hyperactivity is marked Hyperreactivity is marked by aggressive, reckless, or self-destructive behavior, sleep disturbances, and hypervigilance. They may also be re-experiencing an event, which looks like recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event or feeling that one has returned to the traumatic event. They make every effort to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, or external reminders of the event. Cognitive distortions are changes in thoughts, beliefs, and mood, including a persistent and distorted sense of self-blame or others, an inability to remember key aspects of the event, and even a diminished interest in activities. When common reactions do not subside and their stress response remains elevated with the brain in survival mode, there is potential to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. There are many different variables surrounding how children may respond to trauma. Some of them include their age and developmental stage, their perception of the danger. We discussed earlier how two individuals in the same traumatic car accident can walk away with two very different experiences. Our cultural considerations may also play a role in our perception of danger. The trauma history they have endured throughout their life, anything they faced after the trauma, and their support, the adults who can offer help, reassurance, and protections. Children with complex trauma histories may have problems thinking clearly, reasoning, or problem solving. They may be unable to plan ahead, anticipate the future, and act accordingly. While functioning in survival brain, they may have trouble thinking a problem through calmly and considering multiple alternatives. They may find it hard to acquire new skills or take in new information. They may struggle with sustaining attention or curiosity. They may also show deficits in language development and abstract reasoning skills. Many children who have experienced complex trauma have learning difficulties that may require support in the academic environment. Psychiatric labels like oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, and bipolar may be given to youth for symptoms that may be a result of their trauma. You can mimic almost any psychiatric disorder by trauma. Unfortunately, the end result of that is often being overprescribed medications that are not helpful. Socially, children who have experienced trauma tend to be distrustful of others, withdrawn. They may misread cues and have overly rigid or lax boundaries. Youth who have experienced complex trauma often have limited experiences identifying a range of emotion in themselves and others, as if they have a trial-sized crayon box of emotion of only 4 ways to react. They may know happy, sad, and angry, and they respond based upon this limited scope of emotional understanding, instead of having a full-size crayon box of emotions to choose from, like joy, frustration, boredom, or many others. You often internalize and/or externalize stress reactions, and as a result, may experience significant depression, anxiety, or anger. Their emotional responses may be unpredictable or explosive because they perceive a chronic threat and lack of safety. Emotionally, youth who have suffered trauma have trouble calming themselves down, difficulty describing their feelings, and often feel self-critical, anxious, worried, ashamed, guilty, and rarely experience joy. Their combined experiences shape the child's view of themselves and the world around them. They may feel some or all of these. I'm not safe. The world is dangerous. I can't trust anyone. I am not worthy. People want to hurt me, or I deserve bad things. All of those thoughts, feelings, and experiences will be displayed in their response to trauma. This slide represents 2 of the major trauma stress symptoms a youth may experience: hyperarousal and dissociation, along with their potential responses. In the hyperarousal continuum, when feeling threatened, the youth can become resistant, defiant, and aggressive as the trauma or stress increases. Many of these youth feel unsafe in situations where youth without trauma histories would feel safe. A young person in the dissociative continuum, when faced with fear, does not want to be noticed. This looks like compliance, but they can reach a complete dissociative state. When youth dissociate, they mentally separate themselves from the experience or block off thoughts, feelings, or memories about the trauma. Youth living in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze may wake up in the state of alarm. As soon as they feel threatened, they may start to escalate quickly through the stages, from resistance to aggression or compliance to dissociation, away from calm, rest, and felt safety. When a hyperarousal youth gets pushed too far, you can tell they will have a reaction. But when a dissociative youth cannot, with the dissociated youth, you cannot. They've checked out. In addition to all of those feelings, thoughts, and bodily responses to trauma, we are now in the midst of a global pandemic. We know some of our youth struggle with everyday experiences, but now, within the last year and a half, they were faced with being cut off from family, friends, and the support of their communities. Some children in my area went home for spring break in 2020 and have not returned to a formal school setting. Recognizing the need for immediate action, some of our nations led the way for others with our unique COVID responses for protecting our communities. I think Dr. Rodriguez-Lombert helps to shed light on our ability to adapt, modify services and responses to our communities by this statement, and I quote, "More than any other population in the country, the shared experience of surviving a pandemic is in our blood. It is not historic, it's current for American Indians. This is our reality. We took it seriously because we had to." There is so much truth in that statement. We are now facing a re-traumatization by infectious diseases. Tribes have historically been impacted by communicable diseases. This has had lasting impacts on how many of our communities operate currently and will moving forward. Some challenges a youth may feel in response to the pandemic include out of balance with an interruption of their normal routine, socially isolated, a disruption of healthy stress relief, for example, when community events came to a halt or the local gym was closed, a job loss of their own or someone within the home, food insecurity because of that loss of income, or sickness. Other challenges may include less connection with friends and supportive adults because distance learning has detached them from a supportive teacher and their family of friends they enjoyed spending time with at school. Being cut off from team sports or a supportive adult outside the home. Lack of engagement with our communities or extended family. Fears, worries, and living with uncertainties. And of course, grief and loss. At any given time, they may have asked themselves, am I or a loved one going to get it? Am I or a loved one going to die? How long will this last, and will it ever go back to normal? Since the pandemic began, many people have reported a long list of difficult emotions. Sometimes these emotions seem to come out of nowhere. When we are in a sustained period of unpredictability, we can start having symptoms of anxiety, such as difficulty sleeping, always thinking about the situation, feeling keyed up or on high alert, and having difficulties calming or soothing ourselves. Loss, either loss of a loved one or loss of lifestyle, can also bring about symptoms of feeling down, tired, or sad, and having a loss of energy. It's common to not feel like doing things we once enjoyed or to avoid family and friends. In your handouts, you will find a document titled Understanding and Coping with Reactions in a Pandemic. It was developed by the Childhood Violent Trauma Center at the Yale Child Study Center and provided by our partners at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Feel free to review that for further information. Young people tend to hold their relationships very close to them because they are in a developmental stage where social interaction is important. The relationships that may be affected might be their romantic relationships by not being able to see their partner, other friendships, parent relationships, if a parent lives in another area and is unable to travel due to restrictions, and other supportive adults outside the home. Most, if not all students, have been impacted by having to move from in-class instruction to distance learning or working with packets sent home from school. Students may struggle in general, and for those students who require one-on-one instruction, they may not have immediate access to their teachers. Whole families have been impacted in more ways than one. With students being home, parents are now teachers, which can create additional stress for everyone, especially if a parent is also working from home. If the youth is involved in the juvenile or child welfare systems, as you know, many of those systems had to modify their service delivery to that youth and family. Court hearings may have been delayed or required virtual attendance. Community service providers may have been closed or had services adapted to follow new COVID safety protocols. These changes, while put in place for the health and safety of all involved, may have caused additional stress and hardship on the family. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines childhood traumatic separation as a condition in which children develop trauma symptoms related to familial separation from parents or other primary attachment figures. The separation may be temporary or permanent. So when youth experience family separation under sudden, chaotic, and frightening circumstances, such as parental incarceration, foster care placement, or COVID restrictions, they can develop significant trauma symptoms. Childhood traumatic separation is similar to childhood traumatic grief, as both involve traumatic loss and significant trauma symptoms, but there is a defining difference. Childhood traumatic grief is a condition in which children develop significant trauma symptoms related to the death of an attachment figure or another important person. These trauma symptoms interfere with the child's ability to accomplish the task of bereavement. The main difference between childhood traumatic separation and childhood traumatic grief is grief requires maladaptive grief or permanent separation through death. Not all children who lose a loved one in a traumatic circumstance develop childhood traumatic grief. They may experience normal grief reactions. We have included handouts from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that provide some additional information on childhood traumatic separation, as well as the differences between childhood traumatic grief and normal grief. Those may be helpful for you for future reference. Grief is a normal process of reacting to a loss. It can include any change we are not wanting or expecting. Traumatic grief may occur when the individual perceives the death as particularly abrupt, distressing, or overwhelming. Unfortunately, our tribal communities have experienced a great deal of loss over the last year and a half. The loss of our loved ones was made even harder to endure because of COVID restrictions put in place for the protection of our communities. Ceremonies we have for our members who have walked on may have looked very different this year within each community. Our youth, who are used to having those connections and extended support systems from their tribal community during times of loss, may not have been able to seek that comfort as they have in the past. As members of the team working with youth, it's important we have a good understanding of what they may be facing. First and foremost, everyone grieves differently. The stages listed are common reactions to grief. Although they are identified as stages, the stages are not linear. So it's not uncommon for people to alternate between the stages at any given point. They may have been through the stage of anger and begin to experience some acceptance, but then revert back to anger. Some people are more expressive with their grief, while others tend to experience grief more internally. It's important to not have any expectations about the grieving process. Denial can serve as a buffer for the immediate shock over the death. One may try to block out events because those events are too painful. Intense emotions can be masked as anger. Anger may be directed at anyone or anything, even toward the person who died. Some people use bargaining as a way to gain control over the situation. If only statements such as, if only we took him to the doctor sooner, or prayers of, if only You will take away the pain. I promise to do this or that. Depression can take the form of sadness, regret, and worry. Depression can also be about our quiet preparation for our loved one's journey. Acceptance is making peace with the reality of the loss and evolving into a new normal for you after that loss. Difficulties specific to childhood traumatic grief surrounding the loss of a loved one may occur across developmental stages that include intrusive memories about the death. They may appear through nightmares, guilt, or self-blame about how the person died, or recurrent or intrusive thoughts about the horrifying manner of the death. Avoidance and numbing can be expressed by withdrawal, the youth acting as if they are not upset or avoiding reminders of the person, the manner in which they died, or the event that led to the death. Physical or emotional symptoms of increased arousal may include irritability, anger, trouble sleeping, decreased concentration, and fears about safety for oneself or others. There may be feelings of guilt and questioning how or why this happened. Many of us experience strong emotions about anything related to the situation that can remind us of that experience. Think about your favorite song. If you were to hear that song right now, a flood of memories about where you were when you first heard it, or who you enjoy spending time with while listening to it will most likely enter your mind. We all have reminders. 3 types of reminders that may trigger distress in children experiencing childhood traumatic grief are trauma, loss, and change. As we discussed earlier, during the course of a traumatic event, everything associated with it may be linked in our brains with the trauma. Traumatic grief reminders may be places, situations, people, sights, smells, or sounds reminiscent of the death. They may include a street corner where a fatal accident occurred, the bedroom where a parent died, or fear of large gatherings because family members contracted COVID at a large gathering. In addition to trauma reminders, youth who have experienced the loss of an individual important in their lives may also experience loss reminders. Much like trauma reminders, loss reminders can include people, places, objects, situations, thoughts, or memories that are reminders of the person who died. These can include events that the individual was supposed to be at, like a family reunion, or when a new coach replaces a beloved member of the community, on birthdays or anniversaries, and actual physical scars. Change reminders are certain things reminding the child of changes in his or her life resulting from the death. For example, moving to a new house or having to walk home with a babysitter rather than an older sibling who died. The youth we work with can be at additional risk if you add any of these other factors: a history of anxiety, episodes of depression or suicidal thoughts, learning and attention disorders, be a victim of child abuse or having been witness to domestic violence, a loss of income, loved ones particularly vulnerable to COVID, or those who experience less supervision at home. Again, it's important to note that each youth is different and will have their own individual response to any given stimuli. We have provided you with some information on what some common reactions may look like as your team works toward identifying the young person's strengths, applauding their uniquenesses, and addressing their needs. It's important to recognize potential stress, trauma, and grief responses and make every effort to provide a trauma-informed approach to their care. Anna, were there any questions that needed our attention?
Hi, Kimmy, thank you. We do not have any questions in the question pod right now, so we'll just invite you all to submit your questions because we can pause to answer questions that come in. We did have several great comments in our chat, and so thank you to everyone who has been contributing to our chat box. I'll just bring to your attention one concept that was brought up in the chat was the response of a youth feeling more free because they were actually feeling stressed in the school environment. So as COVID caused youth to not be in a normal school setting, that youth was actually feeling more comfortable because they were at home. So I'll let you provide maybe just some comments or feedback on that.
Sure, absolutely. Each youth, of course, reacts differently to the situation that they're placed in. I know, I know personally, some youth within our community struggled with the fact that they weren't so closely assisted throughout the school day. But again, yes, there was a lot more freedom. I know that my daughter herself, who was a senior this year, she really enjoyed being the distance learning because she felt as though she wasn't tied down to school and she didn't have to be there in person all the time. So yes, I think each one can respond differently.
Thank
I'm going to
you.
turn it over. Oh, I'm sorry. Going to go ahead and turn it on to Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great start for us, Kimmy. And I'm just going to go ahead and move us into talking about, so now that we have a sense of what trauma is and how it impacts youth, and specifically, during this pandemic, what some of those impacts may have been, as well as what some of the impacts from grief and loss can be on our youth that come into our courts. I'm going to move us along and talk about, so what do? We want to move into talking about how do we be trauma informed? How do we take this information and how do we apply it? So what we want to first start off with saying is that what is it really going to take for us to be trauma informed? And we really need everyone that is involved, that interacts with young people and their families, to be involved in this process. So we need the actors of the juvenile healing to wellness court. So those caseworkers, probation officers, attorneys, judges, those providing services to the youth in that respect. But we also, of course, can't do this without the engagement of their families and of the youth themselves. And then the outer circle that you see on the screen are those actors that may not be directly involved with our court, but we can't do it alone. We can't do what we do in a vacuum. And so we really need those outside actors, those external actors, which could be, extended family. It could be their peers, their friends. It could be the educators that interact with them, or the elders, or their clan relatives, or members of their society, or community leaders, or other agencies in the community, organizations in the community that serve them. And then just other members in the community, the whole community, being involved in this process and understanding what these young people that have trauma histories go through and how it impacts them. Next slide, please. So when we have everyone on board, we really need everyone that is on board to have a paradigm shift. So we may be used to seeing youth, seeing our clients and our families, and maybe we just simply wonder, what's wrong with them? Why can't they just comply? Why can't they just get it together? Don't they want a better life for themselves? Don't they want to be a good parent? Don't they have dreams and goals? Why do they have to keep living such a tough life? So if you've ever been someone that has had any of these thoughts or has felt this way, it's not uncommon. You're not alone. But it's really going to take for us to have a shift in our thinking and in the paradigm that we're working from, and change to really asking, what has happened to the youth? What has happened to the family? What has happened to that community? Really looking at the root cause, and that root cause could be trauma. It could be the lasting impacts of trauma. So where does healing need to begin in order to see the kinds of changes we want to see and that we hope and pray for? It really begins with this paradigm shift. Next slide, please. So this new paradigm shift that we're talking about, it takes putting on trauma goggles. So if you guys have ever worn goggles when you're swimming, I know for myself, I have this trouble with like opening my eyes underwater. I don't like to do that. And so I have to wear goggles if I'm gonna be underwater. But when we're thinking about those goggles, it really helps us to have our eyes wide open, and it helps us to look underneath the surface. So when we're thinking about this in terms of the youth and the families and the communities that are impacted by trauma, it's really looking at those surface level things, maybe those behaviors that are very obvious to us, those risky behaviors that youth are involved in, those risky behaviors that their families are involved in, and that we witness and that maybe we experience firsthand, that it's really looking at those behaviors and questioning and wondering what the function of them are, the reason for those behaviors, and that understanding that these behaviors are stemming from the need to protect themselves and to seek safety and to avoid danger, and that that's what trauma triggers and responses are. They are biological responses that actively protect a person, um, and it's the activation of their survival response system. So it's not a choice. But just because it isn't a choice for them to have these trauma responses, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done about it. Next slide, please. So once we have our trauma goggles on, we can begin to support our youth and our families in ways that might help to heal their trauma, or to help them understand, arm them with the understanding and with ways of coping with their trauma responses. It can also help us as service providers prevent from re-traumatizing them by creating a safe environment for them, by ensuring that the way that we interact with them doesn't worsen the trauma experience that they're having, that the systems that they're entering into with us, this legal system that they're entering into, isn't going to further re-traumatize them. So through our juvenile healing to wellness courts, we can provide psychological and educational supports. For example, we can provide them access to therapy if that's within our capacity. We can provide them academic tutoring because we know we've heard about the impact that trauma can have on cognitive functioning, and it can make it a struggle to be able to progress academically. And so providing tutoring can help with that. We can also support relaxation, which means we could do things like teach skills to help them relax when they are having a trauma trigger or trauma response, when they're hyper aroused or disassociative, when they're feeling unsafe. We can also set up the environment to be relaxing. And then we ourselves can be relaxing. We can be a person that they interact with that doesn't further their hyperarousal, but someone that is relaxing and calm that they can interact with. We can also help with emotion identification, regulation, and expression, and we'll go through some of those strategies. And then we can also help with cognitive restructuring, which is basically changing their negative thinking patterns, because that's one of the responses to trauma, is getting into these negative thinking patterns. And so really being able to support young people who are impacted by trauma to recognize those thinking patterns that are not helpful for them, and to support them in building skills to change that thinking. Of course, we can provide caregiver support because, if we're struggling with supporting these youth because of their trauma responses, because of their trauma histories, can you imagine their caregivers and what they're going through? And so being able to support them in whatever way we can, even just helping them with transportation, helping them with just some basic things that could ease some of the stress that they may be dealing with. And then executive functioning, this means helping them learn skills of planning, of staying focused, of following instructions, prioritizing tasks, setting goals, controlling their impulses. And this can also be learned just by us as adults modeling that for them, as well as through predictable routines that we create for them in their environment. And then the last one is enhancing safety. This is where we are creating a sense of physical and psychological safety. Next slide. So this is a handout that you can refer to, and I'll let you look at that in more detail, but it talks about a type of therapy that is used to treat trauma that is pretty popular and has been shown to have evidence of effectiveness for Native youth. So we might not be therapists, so this can be a helpful handout and just understanding what the therapy experience can look like for a young person, as well as the handout also goes into just kind of explaining, we as lay people that are not mental health professionals, how we can support a young person who is impacted by trauma. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. So one of the things on the screen that you see is number 5. For example, we may not be the appropriate person that a young person discloses a full narrative of their trauma experience with. But we can be that adult in their life that is open, that is non-judgmental, and that listens if they want to share anything, and that anytime that they disclose something, that we refer them to the resources that they need to deal with that. So this is just a handout that you guys can look more into some of these different components of this therapy. Next slide. So what does it mean to create a sense of safety? That's what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of our time, is how do we get to that point where our clients feel safe, that they feel safe psychologically and physically. And this is just what we're aiming for. It's for them to feel protected from harm, as well as for them to feel like those that they love are protected from harm. Next slide. So how do we create this sense of safety? So we're going to be going over some strategies in 4 areas. The first one is creating a safe environment. We're also going to be talking about ensuring supportive adult-youth interactions. In this case, maybe they're young adults, providing opportunities for connection. And then the last area that we're going to cover is skill development and understanding and managing emotions. Next slide. So we're going to begin with the area of creating a safe environment. As you can see on the screen, we have some examples of things that you can do physically in your environment to create safety. We all may have those safety plans in place. We all may do drills, in case of a fire or an emergency, and those help to create that sense of safety for those that we're serving. When they come into our courts, when they come into our buildings. But we also can think about, what are some things that may be triggering? What are some things that may make them feel not comfortable in that environment? We can think about some things like lighting. We can think about some things like leaving the doors open or having locks on the doors. We can think about some things like even just the sounds. Sometimes we can't always predict what's going to trigger a young person and their trauma response, but when we realize that something is triggering for a young person, that we can change that. It could be a smell, it could be a sound. We could incorporate some traditions and rituals from our tribes that are helpful and calming, and make them feel comforted because it's a familiar sound or smell or familiar ritual that they do. And just being able to, anytime that we are with them, creating those norms and expectations. Next slide. Another thing we can do to create safe environments is to provide predictability and consistency through routines. So especially for a young person in their trauma history, maybe came from something that was very chaotic, in which they just didn't know what was going to happen next, what to expect. And so really having those predictable and consistent routines is going to give them the comfort in knowing what to expect. It's going to give them a sense of just feeling like um, they don't have to be on the lookout. They don't have to wait for something unexpected to happen. That they can feel calm, and we can do that through those daily schedules, through wellness activities that we do routinely, that they can look forward to, through rituals that we partake in, at certain times of the year during certain seasons that they just know to look forward to. And then any time that we're going to change things up, being able to just give them that cue, that warning that, hey, things are going to change. Things are not going to go as expected. And we just want you to know that that's just this one time that things are going to change. And so really reassuring them anytime things are going to change for them. And then ensuring that in our routines, we give that time for self-care, because sometimes we expect people to do self-care, but we don't really give them the time to do it. And so really incorporating and carving out those times to do self-care, because they might not get a chance to do that on their own. They may feel uneasy about doing that on their own, so incorporating that into their routines. Next slide. And then another thing that we can do to create a safe environment is really to manage our expectations. So that may include just the expectations of screen time, especially when we're working in this virtual environment. We all know the wear and tear that screen time can have on a person. And so, really especially if we are only doing only doing virtual activities, this can be very difficult for them. So really managing those expectations of how much time we're asking young people to be on the screen, and then managing our expectations of, I know it's really comforting to be able to see faces when you're presenting or when you're teaching or when you're working with someone, but that expectation of keeping their cameras on. And then really, being able to give them uh, choices. Sometimes that may be difficult because there may be limitations to the choices that we can give. But if we can be creative, if we can find ways to incorporate choices, because that will also give them a sense of ownership and a sense of control over their life, maybe in a way that they haven't really experienced because of their trauma histories, haven't really felt like they've had a sense of agency. And so giving them choices will make them feel more safe. And then providing information that we give them in easily digestible amounts. So if we're giving all this information to them and their executive functioning is limited and they're struggling cognitively, they're not going to be able to take that all in. And then our expectation that they did take that all in, that they remembered all that information, that they learned everything that we taught them. And so really managing that expectation of how much information they can take in. And then anytime, every time, acknowledging their efforts and their strengths. I know that we can lean towards more correction and wanting to correct them and noticing when they're out of place or out of step and correcting them. But that's actually can be a trigger for them, or can be actually do the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. And so really acknowledging their efforts is going to be more helpful. Next slide. We also want to make sure that we have positive adult youth interactions, and that's the next area that we're going to go over for creating a sense of safety. We want them to be able to have adults that they can trust. And that means adults that are consistent, that validate their feelings, that are protective and unconditional. This may be a new experience for them, and that in the past they haven't really had positive experiences in their relationships. So this may be something that they're getting used to, and so it may take some time for them to trust you. But relationships is really important. Next slide. Another strategy in creating those positive adult-youth interactions is reflective listening. So there's a lot of resources out there about how do you go about reflective listening, but it's basically, another word for it is attunement, but it's basically, having acceptance and respect for all of a child's feelings. That means listening first and practicing the skill of reflecting back to them what it is that they told you, and it's naming the feelings that you feel like they're expressing to you and reflecting that back to them. And it's being able to just listen rather than just jump straight into problem solving whatever we feel like they're struggling with. Next slide. So banking time is another strategy that can help us with adult-youth interactions, especially if the interactions that we have with young people tend to be more punitive in that, they come to us when they're in trouble. This is really a time when we can build those relationships, and it's really setting aside an amount of time that we spend with them that isn't going to be for the purpose of correcting them, but it's actually for the purpose of getting to know them better. And this happens regularly. So if we're just doing this sporadically, it's not going to work, but it's really a strategy that takes, consistency and routine to really get the best out of it. And both the adults and the students will feel like they're getting a lot out of their relationship rather than it just being like a transactional relationship. Next slide. Another strategy for enhancing our adult-youth interactions is depersonalizing behaviors. So our young people might respond to us in these negative ways, in these ways that are hurtful, in these defiant ways or disassociative ways, but really depersonalizing how they're responding to us and being more inquisitive about their behaviors rather than reactive, because the behaviors that they're exhibiting may not actually be about us. It may be a trauma response. There may be something else going on with them that we don't see or realize at first. Next slide. So children who have experienced trauma have a difficult time managing their emotions. They may act out and they may tend to provoke people. So our role as caregivers and as service providers as we're interacting with them is to be that emotional container for them. So even when they are acting out and they are aggressive, that we remain calm, that we model and demonstrate what it means to remain in control of ourselves, and that we're able to tolerate those strong emotions that they're giving us, because sometimes that can be scary for us and unsafe for us. But youth can really be checking to see if you're really in it, if you really care about them, or really kind of pushing your buttons, really trying to see what it is that um, is going to get you to be another person that just leaves them and leaves their lives. And so if we can instead be that emotional container for them, um, that can really help in our relationships with them and building that trust. Next slide. So this next area is on providing opportunities for connection. So when we're trying to create a sense of safety, if we can provide opportunities for our young people to connect, so whether that means they're connecting with us or they're connecting with their peers, whatever that connection looks like, but it's really a way for them um, to know that they're not alone, and that when they're able to make these connections, it'll make it more likely that if they ever need it or when they need it, they're going to ask for help and they're going to accept help. And then we can help to create these opportunities for connections anytime that we give them a chance to contribute to the greater good. For example, if we include in our programming opportunities to volunteer, things that they can do, small acts of kindness that they can do for someone, um, just to help them see that, building connections can often mean us taking the first step to reach out to others. Next slide, please. This is a handout that we included, so I'm going to go ahead and let you refer to that. And it's an activity that you can do with a young person. It's called the Circle of Trust, and it helps them to identify people in their life that they can trust. Next slide, please. Another strategy that we can use to help build connections with young people is check-ins, having regular check-ins. Again, this has to do with just getting to know young people and seeing where they're at, emotionally, how they're feeling about things. So we can do this one-on-one with them or as a group. We can do this not just check-ins with adults, but giving them opportunities to have check-ins with each other, with their peers, with others who maybe share a similar experience with them. And then anytime we do have these check-ins, if the adult can also share about themselves, because we often ask young people to share their most intimate experiences, we ask them to we want to get to know them, but we also have to be willing to let them get to know us. Next slide. And of course, I just wanted to throw this in there because, we may be having to do this virtually depending on our situations. And so you can actually do a Google form where you're doing a check-in. So it doesn't have to be just over Zoom. You can have them, especially if a young person who has a trauma history in which they are more likely to respond to you if it's done in this format where they don't have to talk to you, they don't have to talk to people. They may open up more if it's done in this indirect way. So it's usually just asking them how they're feeling, checking in to see if they need any help. This is used often by teachers to, especially during remote learning. This was a good strategy that was effective for teachers to be able to check in with students that they couldn't see every day anymore. Next slide, please. Another way to build connections are circles. And so there's a lot of resources. Sometimes they're referred to as restorative circles, but circle time is really just a type of check-in time, and it's just an informal format. It's meant to for people to share feelings, to discuss issues, to learn more about each other. It's a structured time and space where everyone participates, including the adult, and that it's a voluntary thing. So if someone wants to pass, they can pass. So I would encourage you, maybe this is something that you guys already do in your programming that that you find helpful. And I would encourage you to share that in the chat if this is something that you've tried before. Next slide. And as Kimmy mentioned, sometimes, especially with youth who have very complex trauma histories, the opportunities that they've had to experience joy may have been limited. Especially, they're involved in your juvenile system, and so they may be coming with a lot of really tough backgrounds where they haven't really had a chance to just be a kid, to just enjoy themselves and experience joy. So anytime that you can create those opportunities through your programming, that would really help just rewire their brain so that their experiences are not just all negative and traumatic, that they have these new experiences that are rewiring their brains and giving them a new perspective to look at things with. Next slide, please. And then the last area that we want to cover is called managing emotions. And this is where we're just helping them to develop skills in understanding and managing their emotions. So teaching them to ask themselves these questions, when I'm going through a tough time, what kind of thoughts do I end up having? What are some things that I feel during those tough times? And what are some things that I end up doing? You know, and really noticing their reactions whenever there is something triggering them. Maybe they notice like their body, their muscles tense up. Maybe they notice that they begin to get a headache. Maybe they notice that they have these automatic thoughts that come into their minds, or this fear that they feel. And so really helping them to really tune into themselves and understand what it is that how they respond to difficulties that they experience. Next slide, please. And then once they do identify those emotions, it's really helping them to see that they are normal responses to difficulties, to adversity. So normalizing those emotions, um, you know, helping them to realize that it's better to know what those emotions are than to just have them floating out there as being something that they can't really pinpoint, and just letting them know that it's okay for them to feel how they're feeling. Next slide, please. This is an activity as in your handout. It's called the feelings pie chart, and it helps them identify their emotions, and they can think through some things that they're feeling and try to understand and link them to experiences that they're having or things that they think about that really triggers those emotions and during their day. And so this is a good activity that you can do with a young person. Next slide, please. And I'm sure you guys have heard of self-regulation strategies. Mindfulness is pretty common nowadays, so is yoga. Smudging is something that we also do as tribal people, as a self-regulation strategy that we can incorporate. But there's just all different types of strategies that are out there that you can teach your young people to do. Just moving around physically, things that ground them, having smells that they can smell to ground them, having doing muscle relaxation activities or deep breathing, helping them to have a mantra that they can think about whenever they have negative thoughts. So these are just some examples of self-regulation activities that you can try. Next slide, please. And then finally, in this area of managing emotions, there may be some really strong emotions like grief and loss that they're struggling with. And so these are just some examples of things that we can do to help them manage these emotions, giving them opportunities to express their feelings, whether they're doing that creatively or they're just doing that verbally, giving them a chance to really pinpoint those unhelpful thoughts that they're having. Maybe they're blaming themselves for some losses. And so it's really helping them to understand when they're thinking that way and to give them something more helpful to think about whenever they find themselves having those unhelpful thoughts. It's also helping them towards that acceptance, helping them to realize that, it's not really accepting. Acceptance is not something where, it's going to change everything, but it is going to give them peace and the ability to move on. And then anytime that they can commemorate the person that they've lost or whatever that loss is, have a ritual or a ceremony that they can commemorate that person can also be helpful for them. Next slide, please. And we just want to be able to respond in a helpful way whenever a child does disclose trauma, that we're not in shock or disbelief when they disclose something to us, and that instead we react more calmly, we validate them, we believe them, and we reassure them, and we will follow whatever protocols are in place in order to get them the help that they need. Next slide, please. And just a reminder that our young people are resilient, and that resilience can be built up in them and that can be grown. And so even if they aren't the most resilient at one time, they can become more resilient, and we can do that by helping them build these skills that we just talked about. Next slide, please. These are some protective factors for building resilience that when you're thinking about how to support a young person impacted by trauma, you can incorporate some of these things into your programming to help build up their resilience. Next slide, please. And then of course, we can't forget cultural resiliency, really looking at our culture as a source of strength, as a way to incorporate that into our programming, knowing that that's one of the greatest protective factors that our Native youth have. Next slide, please. So hopefully these strategies were helpful, and they helped you to think about how we can support children and youth right now during this difficult time, as well as in the future, whenever it is that they're dealing with very traumatic experiences. I hope these strategies will be helpful to you. Next slide, please. And if you want further support from the National Native Children's Trauma Center, you can go onto the tribalyouth.org website and make a request there for further TTA support. Next slide, please. So I just want to thank you guys for being here today, and I appreciate your presence. And I hope this information was helpful. Feel free to reach out to Kimmy and I if you would like to ask questions or talk about any of this any further.
Thank you so much, Veronica and Kimmy. So much good information shared here today. I hope that all of you are able to check out the resources and the information that were included as part of the handouts. You can visit the resource center that's part of this conference. We have a lot of materials there that you can download and review later. And the wonderful part of our relationship with NNCTC is that if you had questions today or would like further training, please email us, tribalyouth@tlpi.org. We can connect you with NNCTC, and you can request additional training on this topic or other resources, or just get in touch with Kimmy and Veronica regarding this session or other training that's offered by NNCTC. So I want to thank you again today for attending this session, Creating Safe Spaces for Youth and Caregivers in the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court, Addressing Grief and Loss. I did put the link to the evaluation in the chat box. Please click on the link now and take a moment to complete the evaluation. There is also a sign that links to the evaluations in the main virtual lobby. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, so we thank you for taking the time to complete the session evaluation. I wanted to also provide you with an additional reminder that the next sessions will begin in 1 hour, and you can go back into the lobby in the area where you came into this session, and you can enter into the next session. So again, thank you for attending today's session, and we hope you have a great rest of your week and enjoy the virtual conference.